There's a line between fermentation and rot. And especially as consumers, makers, and regulators of fermented foods, especially when something is new, maybe it's from another culture, it's unfamiliar, just even the look and the smell of it, that line seems very thin, doesn't it? Rene Redzepi, he's the owner of Noma, which is probably one of the world's most prestigious restaurants. It's in Copenhagen, Denmark. You need to be on the wait list for 1 year before you can get a table, even if you're royalty. Every single dish that they serve has some form of fermented foods in it. He gives the analogy of a different type of line. He says, it's a little bit more like a line at a nightclub. And as a fermenter, you're the bouncer. And through certain tools and techniques, you can allow some bacteria in while keeping others out. Club rot. This is a nightclub that lets anyone in, right? The good bacteria, the bad bacteria. Whereas a good fermenteur, a good bouncer, you're able to have that discretion and create the right good conditions for a good party, a good time. So my name is Malcolm Saunders. I am the owner and creative visionary of the Light Cellar, little superfood shop in Bowness in the northwest here of Calgary. And for the last 10 years have been preparing fermented foods, things like sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, fermented hot sauce, as well as drinks like kombucha, water kefir, ginger bug. Also the founder of the Calgary Fermentation Festival. We do that every year. Next one's coming up pretty soon here, October 19th. And through the classes, both in person and online, I've literally taught thousands of people how to safely and effectively ferment their own food at home, as well as helped and inspired many businesses start up their own fermentation operation here in Calgary and throughout Canada as well. So I want to share with you some of the tools, some of the principles around fermentation, in particular as it comes to a lot of the kind of newer trends. So very quickly we're going to run through what is fermentation, why do we even ferment, why is this on the rise, and most importantly, how do we ferment? And little things we need to keep in mind that can kind of foolproof, safeguard the foods the public is consuming. So what is fermentation? Well, there's one terminology. It's basically controlled rot. And then there goes that image of the very thin line again. But it's nothing more than the transformation of our food with microorganisms, right? We're just managing it to the point of digestible deliciousness. And in fact, some of our most favorite and beloved foods are fermented. Now, who had tea today? Who had coffee today? Anyone enjoy a little bit of chocolate? All those are actually products of fermentation. So it actually extends deeper and farther than most of us even realize. Why do we ferment, and why is this kind of what seems to be a surge of interest around fermentation that's coming up? Well, I've got 6 reasons. I think there are more, but let's focus on kind of the main 6. Actually, the first one here we'll do. Maybe you don't see that. Maybe I'll bring that a little bit closer. All right, that comes later. It all actually really started, I believe, as a function of food preservation, right? Before the years of refrigeration, before canning, before all these other techniques, if we had harvest, an abundance of cabbage, or a bumper crop of apples, even a migration of birds. Anyone ever seen that BBC documentary, Human Planet? There's a tribe up north, and there's this migration of birds, and the guy's literally grabbing birds out of the air, snapping their neck, and stuffing them into a seal's stomach, which then gets buried for several months, brought out later and enjoyed as a delicacy. Hey, the birds are there. How do we capture that, make the most of it? So there's a certain function that fermentation has played for humans. Second, They make foods fancy, right? The transformation of these foods. Let's take, for example, the very simple, plain, very accessible food that we all know and enjoy, milk. Dairy milk or even almond milk if you're not sensitive, right? We take milk and we can transform it into how many different things? We've got cultured butter, we've got yogurt, we've got kefir. How many different types of cheeses can you think of? Right? Hundreds. All kinds of different variations. The next, and this is a little bit more to our modern day and culture, is features both place and artisan, right? This idea of craft. Craft beer, product of fermentation. We can take foods of place, the idea of terroir, ferment them, and feature them even more. And that's another huge growing trend. Now this one here, those of you guys into health, flora. Have you heard this term, the microbiome? It's kind of the trend right now. Now we have a symbiotic relationship with microorganisms. I don't know if you've heard, but it's said that we're actually 10 times more bacteria than we are human cells. So who's running the show? So we are literally in this interconnectedness with bacteria that all starts the beginning of life down the birth canal. We come from the womb, a sterile environment, and then we get coated with bacteria inside and out. And it continues on. And eating fermented foods and drinks is one way to continue to feed and maintain that culture. And that's some of the research that's coming out that's inspiring people back to fermented foods. Because once, it didn't play so much a role functionally, we got refrigeration, we have canning, we have drying, we have all these other methods. Oh, do we really need to ferment our foods? And the answer is yes, absolutely. To maintain the health of our microbiome, which has been not only related to gut health, absolutely, digestion. We talk about allergens, right? How many people you know that can't digest milk but can eat cheese, right? Or, I can't really do bread, but maybe they can do sourdough. It's been fermented, been pre-digested. It's another function it plays. So it's not only digestion, it's also immunity, right? The majority of our gut holds our immune system. And then some of the latest research is how it affects brain health. Right? The whole gut-brain connection. So there's a huge interest from a lot of the population as that science gets out there that the key to our health is in our gut. And fermented foods are a big part of that. Now this one, next one, everyone gets flavor. Right? Amazing. Some of the best foods in the world, cultural delicacies, are a result of fermentation. They create new flavors, things that weren't there before. Just think of milk in all its various forms as an example. One simple food, we add different microorganisms, we create different environments, and voila, our palette of flavor has increased. And this is it to me. It's fun. I love fermenting foods. I love tasting fermenting foods, exploring that world, exploring that realm. And some, they're a little bit of a challenge, right? To step over that line and, is this really safe? It's a fun journey. And as much as we love fermented foods, we've been born into a culture, a society that fears bacteria. Right? And for very good reason. There's a lot of dangerous pathogens, right? And our improvements in our understanding of microorganisms and our improvements in sanitation have literally saved millions of lives. But maybe we've just gone a little bit too far. Maybe the bouncer's just a little bit too hardcore, right? The party's dead inside. So expanding our awareness and understanding, we know who the good guys are, right? Creating those right environments for what I call a safe and friendly ferment, right? Bringing in those symbiotic organisms. Shifting our perspectives. fermentation in past has been a form of food safety, health safety, sterilization, right? You've heard that idea of, well, drinking the beer was a lot better than drinking the water back then. Well, it was the same water they used to create the beer, but through fermentation, it created a safer product. I believe, and actually much of the research shows, that fermented vegetables are safer than raw vegetables. In fact, there has never been a recorded case of food poisoning from properly fermented vegetables. Doesn't exist. But raw spinach, you hear the odd thing. Now, what about some other foods? What about milk? Meat? There was a woman in the States. She was a nun, Sister Noella. She was crafting a very particular cheese in the old French style. Her cheese was very popular. The health department heard about it. Says, oh, you cannot be making your cheese this way. Made some suggestions, some recommendations to change her process. If you hear her process, you might agree. So first of all, she was using raw milk. Well, that's a no-no. Second of all, she was using only wood utensils and only a wood barrel to ferment in. And third, between batches, she never sterilized. To the point, it was just kind of a lapping of water, just kind of rinsing it out, that had left a thick biofilm of milk and bacteria around it. So yes, suggestions were made, stainless steel, sterilization, so on and so forth. She says, oh, but please just allow me to do one experiment. Let me show you. So her next batch, she did 2 batches of cheese, in fact. One, her traditional way. The next one, stainless steel. To both of those, she added high amounts of E. coli. End result was, predictably, stainless steel, this cheese, had very high amounts of E. coli. But surprisingly, the traditional methods, next to nothing in the end product, no E. coli. They allowed her to continue on using her wooden utensils and her traditional methods. Similarly, there's a case in New York, a guy making salami, raw meat, using only salt and thyme to create salami. No, can't be doing that. Again, did a similar experiment, not just with E. coli, but listeria as well. Exceptionally high amounts into the raw meat at first. He let thyme and salt work its magic. By the end, not a trace. So there are certain conditions that one can create through fermentation. One can be a good bouncer, create a good, safe, and friendly ferment. Now, obviously, the field is vast. I want to cover off, obviously, the ones that I'm very familiar and confident with, that I've been teaching, and that are kind of coming up as trends, right? You see a lot of kombucha. You're beginning to see a little bit of natto. There's a huge field, and we're going to see more and more and more. And some of the principles apply to many of the different ferments. And I'm open to questions at any time, so just put up your hand. Now, main thing is how do we ferment? Where do these bacteria come from? Any guesses? Starter cultures. Yes, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting to think about. Think about humans as farmers of chickens and pigs and ducks and all the other animals that we've domesticated, but we're actually also, in fact, bacterial farmers, yeast farmers, mold farmers. And that's where we're getting a lot of these starter cultures. We've selected them from the wild that have appeared spontaneously. So we can ferment two things with 2 ways. One, with a culture, which is like a domesticated form of bacteria, yeast, mold, whatever you were using. But we can also utilize wild cultures, wild yeast. Now, do you think maybe one is safer than the other? Depends on the circumstance, but not inherently so. There are many, many ferments that you can consume from wild bacteria. And where do they come from? Right? Sauerkraut, the one that I make in my store, comes from the cabbage, comes from the soil. And you've seen this. You can either think of a green or purple cabbage leaf, or everyone has seen a dark purple grape. If you just put that in your mind, can you see like a white film on the outside, right? It almost looks like a dust. Yeah, that is wild bacteria, wild yeast. They're opportunistic. They are everywhere. You are covered head to toe, inside and out. There is bacteria and yeast everywhere. It's in the soil. And we can culture those and create environments for only the good ones to grow and to thrive. So in the process of making sauerkraut, it is a wild ferment. Now there are some ferments you cannot utilize wild cultures. You need very specific domestic cultures, like kombucha requires it. And kombucha, it's a very interesting one. It's not just a microscopic mold. You can see the colony of them, they actually create what looks like a gelatinous pancake. Has anybody ever seen this? It's very interesting, yeah. It's affectionately known as the mother, because it produces babies and it grows. The technical term for it is a SCOBY, which translates, is basically an acronym for a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Now, where do you find one of those in nature? No idea. They don't exist. They have existed in human hands for hundreds, if not thousands of years, been passed on generationally throughout different cultures. And we're in this kind of melting pot of culture where all these different cultures, right? That's one of the interesting things about fermentation, is sometimes the culture defines the culture, right? Especially when it comes to food. If you want to get cultured, go traveling, eat some ethnic foods, some exotic foods, bring in those different types of bacteria. But of course, we all have our prejudice, don't we? It's like a little bit of form of like food racism. Someone in the East would look at someone in the West, their blue cheeses, and go, oh my gosh, you eat that? Someone in the West might look at something in the East and go, oh my gosh, you eat that? Different bacteria, we're just used to different cultures. All right. So, another issue I'm going to talk about, this idea of, this is a technical term, by the way, backslopping. You heard of that? Basically what it is, it's a process of taking your previous batch, kind of tossing it forward, throw it into the next one and the new one. Now, would that create issues? Sometimes it does. Most of the time it doesn't. So as we go through some of the different ferments, backslopping in some cases is absolutely necessary, as atrocious as it sounds. And maybe there's a better term that we can come up with to make it a little bit more friendly. Okay, so two different types of ferments. Generally, we have acid or acidic-based ferments, very easy to measure with pH. And we have ones that are a little bit more neutral, some that are even more slightly alkaline. And we'll talk about some of those. Acidic ferments. Sometimes the name suggests it all. Sauerkraut, sourdough, right? And that's to do with particular bacteria. You know, maybe the one that you've heard the most commonly is Lactobacillus acidophilus, right? So Lactobacillus, that term lacto doesn't refer to milk. No milk going on here. No worries for allergens. That refers to lactic acid producing bacteria. In vinegar, it's acetic acid producing bacteria. Kombucha, they have their own, right? So byproduct of their metabolism is acid. And with these types of ferments, it has an acidic nature, and that's probably the hallmark of what creates that safe environment. But in order to create that, in the case of, let's say, sauerkraut, we also need to add salt. So there's three factors in some of these acidic ferments. So we'll talk about first sauerkraut, pickles, and what I mean by pickles are lacto-fermented pickles. Different than canning, right? So canning is where you take vegetables, throw it into vinegar, heat treat it, so on and so forth. In fact, lacto-fermented vegetables, which create pickles, are safer than canning. You don't need any kind of heat sterilization. You literally just put vegetables in salt water. You let them do their thing. and they acidify themselves, and that's how they create that acidic pickle-like environment. Other things, hot sauce can be done this way, fermenting peppers. There's many different variations, kimchi, but basically taking vegetables. And the first thing we need to do is add salt, typically 2%. You can go higher, you can go slightly less, but the average is 2% salt by weight. And that inhibits the growth of bad bacteria, right? And there's varying percentages. We've cured meats. We've preserved food through salt. And depending on the percentage, sometimes nothing can grow in that environment. But with vegetables, 2% is about the sweet spot. And it's not that these bacteria need the salt. Basically, they're tolerant of it, where the other bad bacteria are intolerant. So it gives them an edge up, a more favorable environment to take a foothold, to start the party and get things going in the club. So 2% there. Other thing we need here is an anaerobic environment. Anaerobic meaning without oxygen. They thrive in an anaerobic environment, whereas other maybe harmful bacteria pathogens require oxygen for their cellular metabolism. So saline environment, aerobic conditions without oxygen, which then creates an acidic environment. And these ferments, they can drop, the standard kind of test is to about 4.6 pH. Some will drop much lower than that, but if it's 4.6 or below, as a result of these conditions, these three things together create a safe and friendly ferment, again, of which there's never been a case of food poisoning recorded in any literature. So that would be an example of acidic ferment with vegetables. There are other acidic ferments. We mentioned kombucha, right? Doesn't require salt. In fact, requires a bit of oxygen. It's an aerobic ferment. Actually requires that. So it primarily relies on that acidic environment. And that SCOBY actually, that gelatinous pancake, it grows to any size shape of a container that you grow it in, right? So if it's a nice little thin mason jar, your SCOBY is going to be about that wide, and it just starts growing thick. So that's why you got to start peeling them off. I've seen some that are like, whoa, many, many, many layers deep. It's kind of like a goldfish. You put it in a larger container, it grows larger. So this one time, because you get so many, and it's kind of like a pet. You got to keep it going, the uptake, that kind of thing. And so I was growing kombucha at home, and it kind of got out of control. It's like, we want to go on vacation. It was summer, and it's just like, came back. SCOBY's huge. I've got more than I need. I've already got lots of kombucha. And I thought about this. I was like, well, just take it out to the compost. And on my way to the compost, I saw the rain barrel, and it had all these apples in it, just kind of sort of half fermenting. I thought, well, why don't I throw it in there? So this bucket came back about a week, 2 weeks later, huge, grew the size of the bucket. And then I saw my daughter's paddling pool, which had been collecting water and also apples for the length of the season. I thought, well, how would I just throw that in there? Paddling pool. And I thought, wow, maybe there's someone in this room that would like to be enterprising and do kombucha slip-and slides. All natural, organic, beautifies your skin as you slide down. Anyways. So the kombucha requires that acidity, and this is a process that requires the back slopping, right? So you take about 10% of a pre-made kombucha, which is acidic, and you add it. Kombucha is fermented from basically black tea and sugar. There's different other, mediums and things you can use, but essentially that's it, sugar water. And by adding in that acid, it helps drop the pH, favorable environment for that kombucha to grow. You add in the mother, and then it's going to create that layer. And it's almost like a protective layer. It becomes its own bouncer. It's just us. This is just our party. We get these sugars to eat. And anywhere from, minimum a week, 10 days, depending then it begins to ferment. And as a home fermentor, you can determine the level of pH, but it can drop as low as 2.5, depending on, taste. Other types of ferments like that are water kefir. Now, you might have heard of milk kefir. And those are, again, it's a specific SCOBY, symbiotic culture bacteria and yeast, and it's not a big flat gelatinous pancake. They look like little globs, I guess best way to describe them. Some people call them crystals. They're clear, they're translucent, and that's the culture. And you just drop that into sugared water, and then it begins to ferment, acidify. Another one that we've been seeing a lot of is cashew cheese, or these kind of dairy-free nut cheeses that are fermented. They end up being more of a soft cheese, more of like a paste. And it's been a bit tricky for some health inspectors because it's not as acidic as a ferment. And a lot of the times it's done with wild cultures, right? You can't just take a regular yogurt starter or cheese starter and apply it to the nuts and seeds. But you can take lactobacillus organisms like a probiotic capsule, open that up. So people are experimenting with it. And it's usually a 24 to 48 hour ferment. It does drop the pH, and some producers I know, they're able to get within that range, no problem, 4.5%. And then others, they add a little bit of vinegar and it drops it. And the one guy who was adding the vinegar, the kind of the side bonus is that it extended out his shelf life of his product. So these ones can be regulated by pH. Quite easily. Now, there are other types of ferments that are alkaline or near alkaline, more neutral. Mostly produced by molds, not so much through the process of fermentation, but more enzymatic. So these molds grow, and then they start releasing enzymes, which begins to kind of pre-digest and break down the substrate that it's growing on. There is one that is bacterial that doesn't turn it acidic, but actually turns it alkaline. And we'll talk about that one. That's called natto. Maybe the most common is, and I would say has the biggest future that we're going to see more and more. There's very, very few people using this now, kind of on, again, a local craft scale, but you're going to see that increase. It's going to come into restaurants. Is koji is kind of the common name, and it's Aspergillus oryzae. And it is a mold. And, again, molds are one of those ones. It's like, ooh, that's a thin line, right? It's like white and it's fuzzy. And it really comes down to look, smell, and taste for a lot of the molds to really know if it's good or not. So this one is grown on grains. Typically, traditionally, it's been done on rice, but it can also be done on barley. This is what makes sake, wine. This is what makes amasake, which is a fermented rice beverage, which is not alcoholic, but just very sweet. It's almost like a creamy kombucha in that way, just to kind of loosely describe it. It's also what helps us create miso and shoyus, like nama shoyus, traditional soy sauces, garums, etc. There's another one, tempeh. And probably Indonesian culture is maybe the best well-known for creating tempeh. This one I brought my notes. What's the culture's Latin name is Rhizopus oligosporus. So both of these are very short ferments, 1 to 2 days. Sterilizing, this one typically grows on beans or a combination of beans or grains, soy most notably. And you'll want to basically essentially sterilize those beans. And this is something where you can't wild ferment tempeh, right? You can't just leave some soybeans out and just hope it turns into tempeh, that the mold will catch and away it goes. This is when we actually have to have a very specific culture. So you sterilize the beans, basically pasteurize, create a blank slate, and then inoculate it with these spores of the Rhizopus oligosporus and allow it to take over. And as it does, it outcrowds any other bacteria. Now, the first time I made this, I was like, what did I do wrong? It went from white to black. very quickly. And black, ooh, you start seeing black mold. I mean, that is like, yeah, I tossed that batch very quickly. But what I didn't realize is that was it just in its sporing phase, right? It's like it's giving out its seeds. And they're in some culture, especially in Indonesia, there's a very special dish where they let tempeh go all the way to that black spore phase, and it's a delicacy. Acquired taste, I think, but safe nonetheless. Safe nonetheless. All right, these ones here are in your kind of 6.5 to 7, maybe 7.5. The longer you let it go, especially the tempeh, the more alkaline it gets. And one of the biggest kind of concerns, which is not even a concern really from a health perspective, is with tempeh, two things can go wrong with it. And actually, I'll just back up. These acidic ferments, they're almost all done at room temperature, something that's called mesophilic, kind of medium temperature. You don't need an incubator, unlike something like yogurt, right? It's a thermophilic. It likes heat. It needs that nice warm environment. These ones, room temperature, no problem. And they thrive best at that. These ones that you get into a little bit more specific, warmer environments, moist environments, perfect for molds to grow. And yeah, 24 to 48 hours. So two areas that can go wrong here with tempeh is if it gets too hot, you actually kill the organism that you're wanting to culture. But then the only thing that happens is that there's another bacteria that comes in, which creates our third one, called natto. And that takes over because it can actually survive very high temperatures. And
so we've been dealing with natto recently as well.
Yes.
It's becoming more popular. And the acidic ones, I think most people can get their brain around.
Right.
The dropping
Yes.
pH, we know that nothing can grow. The bacteria is out competing it. It's this alkaline one, I think, is more difficult.
Yeah, no, for sure. So one technique that a number of tempeh users will do is they'll actually soak the beans in vinegar or even cook them in vinegar. So you're starting off with an acidic environment, and those molds will grow, and then they change the pH. They increase it back to neutral. So you can have something, start off as a 4 pH, inhibits the bacteria, allows those molds to grow, to outcompete. In the case of natto, it's creating like a biofilm that just covers all of the beans, the grains. And I was really trying to think, I know with natto, it actually does, it's anywhere from 8.5 to 9 on the pH scale, and you can measure that. As it ferments longer, it gets more ammonia, and so I think that's doable. Some of these ones, like the tempeh, you let it go to 9, it's more that special flavor that maybe not everyone is going to enjoy. So that is one trick I did come across is, vinegar in the beginning and then letting the sporing happen. And really, these are all, old traditional ferments. It really is. It comes down to relying on smell, taste, look. This koji is described as having an intoxicatingly sweet, earthy aroma.
Did you say those were done at room temperature?
No, just slightly warmer. Yeah, so maybe not quite as warm as a yogurt, but definitely warmer than room temperature. In Fahrenheit, it's about 90 degrees. Like tempeh, you start off at about 98, and then once these spores start fermenting, they create their own heat, and it evens out about 98 or so. But natto, one of the ways you can sterilize natto and actually do a backslopping process is it can survive quite high heat. So you can boil soybeans or whatever substrate you're using, kills off all of their bacteria, and then this Bacillus subtilis, it's called, survives. In fact, this bacteria holds the record for surviving in space for 6 days, longer than any other bacteria. Just a fun little side note. All right. What other questions do you have? What else are you kind of running into issues?
Oh, I was curious, at what point on the pH scale would something not healthy in terms of acidity or how alkaline it is
Right. Okay. Good question. So, at what point on that scale of acidity, if we take, white vinegar is about 2 on a pH, I would say, anything more than that, it's just going to become. It would be hard to even get it down the system in that regard. So, 2 on one end. I haven't seen many foods. I mean, I'm sure there are. Probably some cheeses. There's traditional ferments in the north, like in Alaska, where they're fermenting seal. Very like strong ammonia like aromas, probably higher than 9. But again, pretty hard to, to get past that in the body. There was a case of 14 people died from eating fermented beaver up in Alaska. And even though, because they weren't following the traditional techniques, there was, I guess, in the last week or two, more beaver added to the ferment, which then spoiled it. But I mean, that's extreme. That's pretty rare, and something I have no expertise in. I can't tell you how to safely ferment beaver. So.
Could you tell by taste? It's like maybe the product and you looked at it, you tell that you wouldn't even want to eat it. Well, it was done wrong.
All right, I got a story for you. You guys into good, like, kind of almost horror story? Yeah, all right. So this is my early days of fermentation. A friend and I, we'd have sauerkraut parties because, one of the great, vessels used for fermenting is a ceramic pot. And my friend had one, I didn't. Plus, we'd go in on a case of cabbage, we'd get a nice good deal, and that's a lot of cabbage to chop. So we'd get together, we'd just have some fun chopping it, and then we'd load it into this big giant crock that was his. Down it would go into his basement, and all was well, or at least so I thought. So about 6 weeks later, maybe it was 8, maybe it's a little bit longer than that. Finally checked in. Oh, how's that ferment going? Have you been, keeping your eye on it? Oh, yeah, it's all good. So we bring it up and lift off the lid, and this thing was nasty, right? It was just the look of it, right? Fuzzy mold, right? Like just growing, hairy, tendril, like the smell of it, like just a reflex of, oh, put the lid on, let's not go there. And so we hauled this thing out to the compost pile, and just slop by slop, in it goes. And as we start getting down, like, wait a minute, this is looking not too bad. And so then it was a bit of like kind of a dare, chicken dare, right? You go first, you go first. Okay, all together, right? We ate it, and it tasted perfectly fine. Now, of course, I don't make or have those practices in my kitchen commercially, but at home we took that risk. And what was happening was that some ferments, especially things like sauerkraut, the pickles, etc., when it's exposed to air, you're going to get a little bit of surface mold, right? Not a big deal, especially if it's just on the surface of the liquid, right? These fermentation pots, you have weights, you push everything down, keeps it in that anaerobic environment. Now, if there's a little bit of exposure to air, you just get a very harmless yeast. It's called cam yeast, and my saying is keep calm, it's only cam. Right? It's a very harmless yeast, just a white thin. You can actually scrape most of it off. Some ferments, doing the sodas, etc., you actually stir it every day. So if anything does form on top, then it goes into that acidic solution. It can't grow, it can't thrive. So what had happened with this sauerkraut was it had exposure to air because the lid wasn't sealed. And being Calgary, being very dry, that moisture content was going down. So our cabbage was sticking up out of the liquid. So it wasn't just a matter of, a bit of yeast forming on top. This cabbage was literally out of the air, into the air, out of that anaerobic environment. Mold was forming, and so on and so forth. But as we got deeper down, all these conditions were still right. At the bottom of the pot, it was anaerobic. It had enough salt content. The pH was low enough that it was still fine.
So another concept that I think Simon had hard to get around is the doing things at room temperature as well.
Right.
So we did our own sauerkraut in the steel fridge.
Okay. Yeah.
We did it in the fridge.
Oh.
forever.
Yeah, okay, so the comment is about fermentation in room temperature, right? You think, okay, fridge is going to be safer. Sandro Katz, who's known as fermentation revivalist, he's probably the most kind of common, popular name within this field. He's written several books. He calls the fridge the fermentation slowing device, right? So when your kraut is ready, or anything that you're fermenting, then you pop it in the fridge to slow it. And it doesn't completely stop fermentation, but it does actually slow it. So you can ferment in the fridge, but it just takes a long, long, long time. And that's why a lot of times, these ferments were buried in the ground to kind of reach that median temperature, right? If it's too hot out in the air, the ground was the place to go. If it was too cold, ground as well.
My question is really about that. How do you document and make a large batch sauerkraut? How do you determine how much the fermentation goes slower forever?
Yeah. Yeah, really great question. So shelf life, that's a great point. With things like kombucha, with things like vinegar, infinite shelf life. In terms of the fermented vegetables, once we determine a batch is quote unquote done, we'll put it in the fridge, we divide it up into jars, it always remains refrigerated. If at any point it comes out into room temperature, there is a risk of exploding because we seal up the jar, the bacteria are still alive, they're feeding on the sugars, they're feeding on the fibers, they create carbon dioxide as the byproduct of their metabolism. If that's in a sealed jar, that's your biggest risk, exploding. The other thing, when jarring these, again, you want to create those same conditions. Lots of acidic brine to cover all the vegetables, and in anything exposed to air will have a resistance for a while, but eventually it'll be into mold unless it's in that brine. So you always want to make things submerged. Fermentation will continue until the veggies or whatever it's digesting is completely mush, but it'll still be safe and digestible. Yeah, so it's like the idea of the crunchy pickle. Don't let it get too mushy. All right. Any other questions? Good. Well, I think we've reached the end of the talk. Thank you so much, you guys. I hope you had a good day. Thanks for allowing me to come here and share.